Hey guys, how's it going? Today I want to talk about how to destroy a maniac. I receive a lot of messages and I get asked, how can or should I play against a maniac? They can have so many hands, but when I call down, they always have me beat. Well, at first I think we should talk about what is the definition of a maniac. I would say a maniac is raising and three-betting a range that is way too wide, and a maniac is also c-betting and bluff raising way too many hands on the flop and turn for the most part. This is, I would say, the perfect definition of a maniac. And yes, you have some more aggressive maniacs than others, but I think you get the point. The first thing you need to understand is that maniacs have a brain. So most of them are not punting all their money when you also show aggression. And they're also not punting too much on the river. They mainly punt pre-flop, on the flop, and on the turn. You should not increase your cold call ranges too much against this player type, I would say, because when you do this, you're usually stuck with middle pair or another fairly weak hand on the turn and river, and you have no clue what to do when he goes ahead and bets really big. So I would say keep it simple, stick to your solid preflop ranges, because you know how to play those ranges preflop, and when you do this, he will just exploit himself by open raising and three-betting way too loose. And also, you don't need to defend every single hand against a three-bet against him. Yes, I know he's three-betting a lot of hands, and of course you can call a bit looser, because his three-bet frequency is usually higher, maybe he's three-betting 30% or something like this. But you still want to fold some hands against his three-bet, especially when you're out of position. In position, when you know he's going for every pot, alright, go for it. When you think you're so much better, no problem calling most of his three-bets, especially when his size is a little bit too small. But out of position, you still have huge position disadvantage, and yeah, not too much you can do, especially those weaker offsuit hands. Go ahead, fold those hands, no problem. Because always when you call a three-bet, you need to understand that the stack to pot ratio is fairly low, and when you flop a solid top pair against the maniac, we're usually going nowhere. And when you usually want to fold the turn or the river with your actual hand, you are probably better off just folding this hand pre-flop. And post-flop, same story. When you have a super strong hand, remember where your money is coming from. So for example, he raises on the flop and you have a set, right? And you think, well, he can also have some strong hands. I go ahead and three-bet. No, don't do that. Because the maniac has so much air than a regular player that he will just fold way more often to your flop three-bet, especially when the board is somewhat dry. And the beauty is that a maniac is really aggressive. So when you call his flop raise, he is willing to fire another barrel on the turn and sometimes also on the river when he likes the card. When he thinks you have enough middling or weak hands in your range, he's usually going for it and pulling the trigger on the river. And when you realize this, you should understand that the call will produce so much more money in the long run. And yes, sometimes he will make his draw or make his backdoor or hit his two outer or whatever, but this is not important for us. As long as his bluffing frequencies are so big on every street, we are just printing by calling most of the time with our strong hands. I would only suggest to go ahead and 3-bet when the board is super wet and basically any turn card will hurt your hand. Then I'm fine with 3-betting flop. And I would say on those board textures, you will also go broke with a lot of draws and middling type hands like pair plus draw and so on. So on those board textures, it's fine. I would say you should also go ahead and fold fairly weak hands on the flop when you can only call one street. So when you have the plan to call the flop and always fold the turn when he bets again, it's better to fold right away against the maniac. Why that? Well, when he's barreling most of the time after we call, we just lose a ton of money by calling the flop because we will never realize our equity. So this is obviously different against other regulars because they have huge checking ranges on the turn and river, but against a maniac, this is just not the case. So when you think with your second pair, you can never ever call the turn, or this board texture is just really bad for your hand, or even top pair is not strong enough, no problem, just go ahead and fold the flop. Because equity realization is really important. Of course, against the maniac, you should also call down a bit looser. Because, as we talked about, when he's betting most of the time on the flop, on the turn, and also has a huge bluffing frequency on the river, even weak top pairs are good enough to call 3 streets. In this situation, when you are on the turn or you are on the river and you are unsure if your hand is strong enough to call, no problem, just open Ecolab or any other equity calculation tool and give him a somewhat realistic range, because you saw some hands from him, right? You should have a somewhat good idea what his betting range could look like. Of course, don't be too optimistic, he's probably not bluffing with any 2 on the river. And then you can take a look if you have enough equity to make this call or not. And please remember that maniacs are super aggressive pre-flop, on the flop, on the turn in general, but when they call your flop bet, they call your turn bet and shove over your river bet, they usually have a really strong hand like everyone else. I would also suggest never slow play pre-flop against a maniac. Sure, maniacs are 3-betting a ton, but this player type loves to see a flop. They want to connect with their 2-hole cards, so in general their fold to 4-bet stat is really low. And this means you want to 4-bet more value hands and remove a lot of your 4-bet bluffs. Because when they never fold, there's not too much to be gained in bluff 4-betting. Plus, post-flop, it's way easier to get stacks in when you play 4-bet pot, because the stack to pot ratio is already really low. And here's also a good tip. On some board textures, you definitely want to range bet in general in a 4-bet pot, but when you play against the maniac and you know he's always stabbing when you check and he's super often going with it, of course the EV of checking is way higher. So when you have a really strong hand or a good hand that's also strong enough, this is the perfect exploit. And yes, this also counts for 3-bet pots. When the maniac has position on you and you know he will always bet flop and turn when you check, give him that option. Especially when he also bets all his no pair, no draw hand, then the check call is so much more profitable than the range bet. Because when you bet and he has absolutely nothing, no backdoor, no pair, he will still fold quite often. When you have a maniac hand you want to share, feel free to post in our Discord group or in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video. Take care guys, good luck at the live felt, and I'll see you next time.